Hello, good morning. I am the representative of the team today. I was saying that it's my turn to represent the team to mention and introduce a great friend, a PhD in psychology, Dr. Salvador Moreno Lopez. He has been a therapist for over 30 years, and he is the author of 3 books. The latest one, Discovering My Body Wisdom, Focusing, published in 2009. And he is also the author of many articles which have been published both in Mexico and in different countries abroad. He is an experiential psychotherapist, and he is a group and human development workshops coordinator. Please, let's give Dr. Salvador Moreno Lopez a round of applause. Thank you very much. It is an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure for me to be here now with you to share some reflections and experiences from my professional practice, especially within the university world in psychotherapist training programs. But I would like to thank Claudia, Marijose, Patricia, Catu, Martin, Sergio, and Max for their invitation and most of all for their careful work so that we can be here now gathered. So for each one of them, I have brought a present, a Mexican craft, which they will distribute among themselves. First, I would like to tell you also something about the context which I'm going to talk about. First, I speak as a university professor and psychotherapist. I work in a psychotherapist's master's program that we call multidisciplinary dialogue oriented. A while ago, I was present in Nick Cooper's workshop. In part, it's similar to what he calls pluralistic counseling. And what we seek in this master's degree is for students and professors to learn to dialogue with different disciplines, not just psychology, but also sociology, anthropology, philosophy, literature, in order to find resources that may help us better understand the people we work with in psychotherapy and be able to better respond to their needs and requirements. So the work that I've done is framed within this dialogue context. Dialogue with psychoanalysts, with colleagues from the systemic approach or from CBT, who all of us somehow agree on our interest to learn to dialogue. This hasn't been easy, but I think we are moving forward. The second invitation I'd like to make is to be present here. And this implies a number of issues. First, don't rush to try to understand what I will say. And I also invite you not to easily assume that you understand what I will say, because I speak a strange language. In a certain sense, I speak Mexican, but it's Mexican Spanish from a certain region, but it's also a language that is already mixed with many experiences and learnings from many friends from different countries and places in the world. So it's a peculiar language. You may find some aspects familiar, but I also hope that you will be patient to let the talk unfold, as if it were a film in which you don't try to understand everything in each scene, but you go along with the scenes, and as the movie unfolds, you change your way of understanding the situations. So, having said this, I would like to express a number of personal beliefs that, of course, I've taken from different authors' dialogues and reflections. Human beings humanize ourselves in relations and interrelationships with other human beings. We build ourselves as the persons we are in everyday experiences in different situations and contexts. From a very young age, we need a loving and welcoming presence, which provides a relationship that makes us feel loved to go out to the world trusting ourselves and trusting others. In these early experiences, some people are more fortunate than others. There are children who feel taken care of, acknowledged, loved, with their own place in life, and others live with uncertainty, inconsistency, rejection, and even abandonment. That's the way they live this important part in a person's life. These early age experiences become present throughout their lives. They transform with the following experiences, the next experiences. However, some of them become kind of frozen and favor the repetition of unsatisfactory and suffering ways of interaction with oneself and with the others. Rogers recognized the importance of these early experiences and theorized on what may happen throughout a person's development in terms of how he or she may not know himself or herself, denying awareness or distorting aspects of their experiences if they don't experience a supporting, loving presence. Gendling, on the other hand, wrote about the frozen holes that make it impossible for us to recognize our experiencing, and which prevent us from expressing ourselves from that place. Thus, we lose the possibility of living the new nature of each moment and circumstance. We can also understand this as a way of losing touch with ourselves, of unknowing ourselves, of listening to ourselves partially or inadequately, with the effects and dissatisfactions that this implies in our everyday life. From his experience as a psychotherapist, Rogers wrote his famous text about the necessary and sufficient conditions for the personality's therapeutic change. At that time, that text revolutionized the way of conceptualizing and valuing the psychotherapeutic process. He proposed a change which implied abandoning the expert professional stance from the therapist to become somebody who accompanies the other person. It also implied moving away from a professional role towards closeness and a supporting presence with the client. Some years later, following Rogers' initial course, Gendling highlights the great importance of not putting anything in the middle between the psychotherapist and the client. There should be no barriers, no obstacles, physical or personal, not at least from the psychotherapist. He highlights the convenience of putting personal worries and problems aside to be fully available. He even points out, I don't want that the attitude to be ready to respond should come between the client and me. This is a quote. And he also reminds us that in every client there is always a person there. Many therapists and therapeutic orientations agree in recognizing the fundamental role of the relationship between the therapist and the client to promote constructive change. There are several ways to call this, and different aspects can be highlighted. For this talk, I have chosen a number of terms that I think are useful and rich to stress some aspects and characteristics of the interaction between therapist and client. These are being present, supporting accompanying presence, presentiality, to accompany, to be in the present moment. These are not synonyms, but they have many shared aspects, and each one of them stresses different sides. However, to have a common reference, I propose a text that I wrote a few years ago about accompanying. Of course, it implies a way of being present every step of the way with a client. To accompany. To accompany is to be with, not in front of, and very few times behind. To accompany is to walk next to another person, following their course and direction, seeking with them the course of what they really want, of what has meaning and value in their life. To accompany is to acknowledge oneself in interaction, in a permanent dialogue and in mutual influence, listening to silences and resonating with what was expressed beyond words. To accompany is to make pauses when the other person stops walking, and to speed up when the other person needs to run. Accompanying means showing alternatives, making invitations without imposing them, following the other person's direction in their search for roads with a heart. Accompanying is letting yourself feel in your body what the other person feels in theirs, and to distinguish that what I feel as mine is different. Accompanying is letting the other person feel my presence. A silent presence very often, but always expressing something. Accompanying is being there for the other person, looking for, with him or her, their human realization in their interactions with others and with their environment. A research by Helen and Greenberg I learned about recently about therapeutic presence also shows several of the aspects I talk about in my text and states others from the point of view of the therapists interviewed. With this, I want to point out that I think there is enough clinical research and experiential material to propose that being present in a way with the client is a priority factor to promote constructive personal change. The question from my context is, how do you learn this? How do we integrate this in the psychotherapist's training process?
So, the thing about the accompanying presence, I want to take it to psychotherapist's training. In this field, for about many years now, I have been asking myself, as I speak about this with other colleagues, how do we learn to interact, as Rogers described, and in particular, how do we develop empathic understanding in terms of capturing an understanding as well as expressing said understanding? It seemed very simple to try to be in each other's shoes, and still it was difficult for some students to picture how to do it. The experiential and theoretical change gave me some new clues. It became clearer that the way was not to learn certain verbal ways of expression or certain pre-designed stances that could try to talk about closeness. The idea was to pay attention to my own sensitivity and my way of experiencing interactions with others. And that's where I started working on a model with some aspects to develop this way of being of the empathic comprehension or understanding. Therefore, we started talking about from another viewpoint about inner silence. And then the next area was something that I chose to call to recover the wealth of the senses, not only hearing or seeing, but also smelling, touching, other senses. And then trying to match sensation or feeling with sense, and then perform activities that helped me to place myself in the other person's shoes by using a mode that I learned from a theatrician that was called the magician as self, and or what's magic as self. And in these lessons that I learned from the world of drama, the idea was to try to be in the role of the other person and to let ourselves feel as though we were them. And the next stage has to do with what I can capture through my own experience of the other. And finally, how do I get to express from my experiencing in interaction or interacting with the other. Of course, in general, the schemes used are limited. Firstly, they are static, and also they appear to be sequentially linear, and so I would like you to think that they are neither static nor linear. So for now it's just a way to refer to something, but in this framework. Then I started using this model. I found advantages and disadvantages, and I thought I couldn't only work on empathy, but it was necessary to have a broader view in which other important aspects could be integrated of interaction. That's how I talked about accompanying present, so as then to train psychotherapists. And in terms of accompanying, there are different aspects related to being present, accompanying a consultant or a client. I would like to mention about how I have proposed students of a psychotherapy master's course the perspective to develop some attitudes, skills, and ways of thinking that enable them to be present accompanying their clients. A challenge here is how can we bear in mind to have a global, complex overview and at the same time focus on certain peculiar aspects without losing sight of the whole. So these two coexisting can be challenging. A first aspect is background, life experience, and I took this idea from a Mexican worker when I understood that this history had to do with where I come from, where I am, and where I'm going, my life history or my biography, but emphasizing mostly what has actually happened. This idea of history seemed useful, mainly because it includes where I come from, where I am now, and where I am heading. In this life history, we find resources and obstacles, and of course, it helps to identify and recognize ourselves throughout the process. And then we talk about preparation to be with the client, and here is where we work on two key aspects: to learn how to be in silence and to need to recognize experiences through senses and to be expressed in this fashion. We distinguish different attitudes and abilities. Another stage has to do with being present in the session with the client. And finally, we deal with what happens when the session ends. In terms of life history, this is a dimension that is present throughout the training process, and here we lay emphasis on the way in which students interact with others in terms of closeness or distance, trust or distrust, the need to control what's happening or flow in the interaction, to follow or direct conversation, listen or respond to verbal musical aspects of a conversation. And I don't mean to say that when I speak about distance or closeness, I'm not saying that closeness is always better. I'm always saying that it's important to recognize or acknowledge how we are doing it. So we also acknowledge ideas and convictions that the students have as regards to how to help people and what psychotherapy is, and we pay attention to the way in which every student is given attention through experiencing and how they express themselves and what it means to be trained as a psychotherapist. As regards to preparation stage, we focus attention on two main skills and some attitudes. The skills, one is inner silence, and to acknowledge sensations with senses, differentiating them from feelings. Attitudes I'll be mentioning later on. To be in inner silence, in a state of inner silence, is the first. In this moment, we connect with a space, as Gendling says in the process of focusing, but in the practice, we have found that this spatial metaphor is useful for some people, but not for others. And this is where we proposed a different metaphor to be in inner silence, quieting inner dialogue. With the pretext activities for discovery that we have worked with, and then I will tell you why I call them activities and discovery pretexts, we talked about the ability to address attention and to continue having attention, to know what we target attention to and what we follow. For instance, when we follow movement of the stomach, when we are breathing, we are directing and focusing on attention. First, we focus our attention in order to identify the movement of the stomach when you are breathing, and then once there, we let our attention remain there, checking on the movement of the stomach as we breathe without experiencing any changes or trying to explain. This gives us the possibility of reflecting about changes that happen without us trying to make them happen. Many times this is a great surprise because we are very used to thinking that if we want for a change to occur, we need to plan it, direct it, and that's how it's gonna happen. And the thing here we propose is just wait, observe the movement of the stomach, and see what happens next. And here also we find obstacles like the need to be controlling, to know beforehand what results will be or what the activity is used for. Sometimes I say, would you be willing to do this activity even if it's good for nothing? So that's the idea, not to have this pressure that everything must serve a purpose, that I must achieve a quick result, and then this in itself can become an obstacle. There's also sometimes doubts in terms of cause and effect related to change, and many times they feel that they're wasting their time. In our culture, we have this need to be producing all the time, doing. Other than that, we are wasting our time. Another similar activity is paying attention to sounds of the environment without trying to know what is causing them. Sometimes attention can flow directly, and sometimes it can be addressed or focused on further away or more distant sounds or sounds that are closer. And yeah, also we have new difficulties. For instance, they call sounds noises or noise. So when we call sounds noise, there is also a negative assessment here. So then they discover that there's too much inner dialogue going on. So it is not as simple just to be hearing sounds without naming them, without knowing what is causing them. But also there are surprises, because when we hear sounds in this fashion, they discover many times that they can be relaxed and feel at peace. They discover that they stop thinking, that the inner dialogue calms down, that they experiment a variety of feelings that they hadn't acknowledged before, and that sometimes memories come back to them. So, as we do these activities, we also point out what we call feeling and what we call sensation and what we call full sense sensation. That is another ability or skill that we wish to develop. As you can see, we need to learn a variation of things at the same time. The only thing that we do is emphasize at a certain given moment a few of the possible learnings.
Tienen los alumnos
Once the students are clear about how to recognize experiencing, we do an activity in couples in 4 stages. I like this activity very much because it's very strong and rich. First, 2 people are sitting next to one another, silently, with their eyes closed, paying attention to their experiencing. And the invitation is for them to pretend that they are alone. Even if one is next to the other, pretend that you're alone. Just pay attention to your experiencing and notice what happens. In the second stage, I tell them now, as an attitude, acknowledge the presence of the other person. Still silently, with your eyes closed, but change your attitude and acknowledge the presence of the other. And you know what happens? Notice what happens. In a third stage, after a previous agreement, one of the persons, without talking, shares some significant experience with the other. And the other person is there, trying to be present and accompanying the other. And in the fourth stage, they can talk about what they experienced in the 3 previous stages. Frequently, students find that it's surprising and puzzling. What they find is puzzling. How can I get so much of the other person without talking? How is it possible that the other person may feel welcome and accompanied without words and without looking at each other? How is it that something changes in the person that shares when they feel welcome and listened to? So now we can reflect on several assumptions. For example, that if we don't speak, we don't communicate. That I can only understand someone with words. Or I didn't know that I could sense with my body organism what the other person feels. To help the other to change, I have to tell them something relevant and sensible. And this is one of the greatest anxieties at the beginning. How do I say this? What do I say? What time do I say it? We discover that it's okay to say nothing. That remaining silent in an accompanying presence, a very rich process takes place. The idea is to help them lower their anxiety, They want to know what they have to say. So, what matters the most in a helping relationship? Sorry, I forgot that the other assumption is that what matters the most in a helping relationship is what the therapist tells the client. That's why therapists feel the pressure to say something sensible. But one of the discoveries is that if I'm available and I let myself feel, I can get essential aspects of how the other one feels. They discover that feeling another person's accompanying presence causes a transforming experience, and that being present accompanying another person is something that happens before and beyond words. Anyway, it can happen with words too, but what I am trying to highlight is that words are not essential to be present in an accompanying way, to feel them, and to foster in this way a change process. I think that I've run too long with the slides. So, as regards the attitudes, some of the attitudes we promote is waiting without rushing, being open to what's new and unknown, welcoming sensations and feelings, not judging or labeling, encountering or finding more than seeking. And as to this, I recommend a paragraph from Siddhartha's book by Hermann Hesse, a very beautiful paragraph about this difference between seeking and finding. It's a text that I usually recommend because it's very rich in its description of this distinction between finding more than seeking, not expecting anything in particular, being patient, following the experience's rhythm, to kindly accept and recognize what is there. To let go of control, to be thankful for the flow of living, to trust in the process of following the experience. As you can see, is a complex task. But what's interesting is that by means of these activities, all of these aspects are developed. I think that what happens is that at different moments, different people gradually pay more and more attention to these aspects. A few years ago, a student from a Human Development Master's degree in Mexico did a research with a Barrett-Lenard questionnaire, a famous questionnaire at some time, which was used to assess clients' perceptions regarding the therapist to see if they perceived the attitudes and conditions. And she did this with students. She did a very broad research with students. But what I found odd about her results is that by the way students responded to the questionnaire, there was no match between the way that experts had qualified the reactions. This questionnaire is built by asking several aspects. What reactions do you think reflect empathy? Which ones reflect unconditional acceptance and which ones congruence? But her results did not match these categories. And so I asked myself if this division of attitudes was perhaps more relevant to theory and to certain moments in which research required these accurate definition of variables, but that ordinary people don't talk about their experience this way. They have a more holistic view. In the stage that consists of being present accompanying the client, each session implies to put into practice, first and foremost, the skills and attitudes that I pointed out. And besides, the possibility to be in the same experiential wavelength with the client and to be able to express your empathic understanding. It also implies inviting the client to pay attention to their own experiencing and to aspects of the situation that they are overlooking. Being present in this way requires being in touch with our own experiencing and the client's experiencing, letting yourself feel, flow, and move with the interaction process among the meaningful sensations and their accurate expressions generated by this moving forward that Gendlin talks about. I think that the being in the same experiential wavelength means being able to get the experiences of the other person, perceiving signals from the other that reveal their inner world, as Siegel says. And then I let myself feel whatever I feel in the encounter to resonate. I am willing to change. This is something very important to remember. Since this is an interaction process, this means that we affect each other mutually, simultaneously. So it's not just that the other one is going to change. I change too in the interaction process, and this requires me to be willing to change in this encounter with the other. When I resonate, being in the same tune, I can give back to the other person expressions and symbolizations in which the other person can recognize themselves in their experience, and this can be moved forward. Finally, empathic understanding is a way of personal presence, experience, and movement which shows the other that I grasp, understand significant aspects of their experience. In the expression aspect, empathic understanding is complex and has many aspects, both in its contents and in its ways of expression. And here we include both bodily and verbal aspects, gestures, movements, bodily posture, and what I also call the music of speaking and of expressing oneself. A methodological proposal. I was saying that an important challenge in the psychotherapist's training process is how to combine a view of the whole in accompanying presence with paying attention to different aspects in different moments. Is it possible then to identify different aspects and paying attention to them differently without losing sight of the whole picture? At the same time, there is a clear need of an experiential history to learn. You have to make the journey instead of just looking at the summary. And here we are tempted to propose a single history for everyone. And in this case, we would not be acknowledging the differences of each student. But at the same time, there's the risk to let everyone find their own way in a training context which is limited by the constraints of a university, by its demands. And frequently, this involves working in a contradictory situation. So our proposal is to acknowledge these contradictions from the beginning, and let's learn to move among these contradictions. In order to take care of the experiential dimension, I have resorted to games or exercises. One day, I started to think that those names were not appropriate for the activities that I use. And so I prefer to call them discovery pretext activities. These are actions that students carry out in order to develop some of the attitudes, skills, and understanding that will qualify them to accompany their clients. But this perspective implies for me that I acknowledge that each student will experience that activity in a unique way, that they will identify certain aspects and not others, and that they will do it in their own way, at their own pace, and that there will be similarities and differences within the group. So this way of working requires for the coordinator to listen to students' expressions regarding their experiences in the activity, to identify what they have noticed, and to understand how they give their experience meaning and how they reflect upon it. A very clear aspect to me about how each person grasps these situations in their own way is when I hear, when they share, that they say, well, when you said such and such a thing, and did I say that? When did I say that? But well, the person heard it that way, and that was the basis from which they carried out the activity. But what matters the most to us now is what they felt, what they experienced, and to reflect upon that to see what implications or learnings it may generate. At the same time, we raised the question of what criteria to use to guide the proposal or the activities. And so I think that first it's important to clarify some assumptions about what meaningful learning is. These assumptions are in the background of our activities. These assumptions are inspired in Rogers and Gendling, and I say inspired because probably there is some transformation process that I've done with them, so I don't want to hold them responsible. I want to thank them because of they inspire to me. The first thing is that it's a key characteristic of human existence is being in interaction with others in the world. This has been very hard to me to understand experientially. And I'm not sure either that I've achieved it completely, but I've moved in that direction, trying to feel and think what it means to be in interaction with others in the world as a whole, with a vision which does not imply adding up parts which are put together, but that the key data is the whole, and that within that whole I can differentiate aspects or parts.
Que lo vivido.
What we have lived always means this interaction in this biographic and cultural context. It always has to do with history. That is why when someone says, I just feel sad, in the question there's a question that is, this relates to what or to whom, because I think this question of interaction is always present, be in the world with others. I cannot understand something as an isolated fact. Every person learns from their own personal characteristics and their life history. The same activity will be experienced with different meanings by every student in every moment, but to learn significantly means experience that encompasses different dimensions, the experience through the body, affection, cognitive, behaviorist, or by context and culture. We are running short of time, so let me just show you a little about how these activities are conducted. First, we clear a space or have inner silence, then we acknowledge sensations, then we do an activity discovery pretext, then I invite participants to write some aspects of what they have experienced, and this writing becomes useful because of two reasons. One, because there is a record that remains over time, and they can go back to this and see what their experiences were before. And in this perspective, time provides a different meaning. And also because not everyone dares to speak up and share, so at least they have this written record. The invitation to share what they have found out, their reflections, talk about implications and applications, and talk with different frameworks of reference in order to complete a cycle of a process that is a spiral. Let me also point out that the accompanying presence is a way in which we can be with the client. It allows us to experience everything that comes to the interaction. It also implies to express yourself from your own experiencing. Given the complexity of being present by accompanying training processes, I have taken some reference points. Learning of two complex skills such as inner silence and experiential recognition, and development of several attitudes that mean openness, availability, respect, and understanding while we are with the client. I have also tried to make some of the assumptions explicit and also some of the criteria guiding my decisions as to how to interact. It is important to point out, however, that interacting with students show a lot of my own experience, and usually
I do my planning, but it's clear to me that I only do this to feel relaxed myself. What I have just presented is a work in progress, which needs to be built upon with dialogue, action, and reflection. I would like to finish by saying some words by Eugene Gendling and a poem of Silvia Elena, a poet from Salvador. Gendling's words. We could constrain ourselves to be together for a while with words, or more usually, silently. I say that our being together is something real that we are doing, even if there is nothing to say. And the poem by Silvia Elena Regalado, its title is Intuition. It says, don't try to suspect heat. Don't interpret it. If you were not in the fire, you will never know the sweet agony of the flame. Thank you very much.
While engaging training people in PCA, maybe we could do a kind of network or a place where many of us who do kind of training tools or training exercises, I don't know how to call them, we share them, we put them somewhere.
Just a minute.
Yes,
¿Podrías ayudarme con la traducción? I think I'm going to need some help to really understand what you are saying. Sorry.
I can try again easily.
Okay.
I think training is a real challenge in PCA.
Yes.
And you brought several examples of training. And in the world, we are several people who have examples. And I was thinking of doing a network with internet, for example, of sharing the kind of exercise that we use in training to be mutually enriching ourselves. Mm-hmm. That would make it resources worldwide for training people in PCA.
Yeah. Gracias.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with you. I think that making these networks with those of us who are working with training processes, these networks can be very valuable. So the question or the comment is that he thinks it would be very good to have some network that could help those of us who are working in training within PCA to make links with one another. And I think that this is a very rich, valuable proposal, and I subscribe your suggestion. I would be very pleased to be part of this network. I think there's a lot to share. Right decisions, difficulties, materials that we can really use. Thank you.
Example of, I think there must be experiences of physical healing through the kinds of paying attention that you describe.
An example of
An
what?
example of physical healing through the processes that you describe.
Lo que está diciendo es que debes de tener algún ejemplo de curación física en los procesos que estás haciendo.
Puedo de momento recordar.
Let me tell you about two cases. One is about a student that at a certain class was experiencing a severe headache, and talking with him, it turned out that these headaches were very frequent, and it was hard to get rid of them, and he was taking more and more painkillers in order to be freed from these headaches. So basically what we did is we asked him to pay attention to his body, to be with the group, and that he wouldn't try to change anything, just pay attention to the pain, and then also focus on other bodily parts as to how he was feeling. Then we invited him that from what he was feeling, he would express himself with whatever came, sounds, words, movements, or just being quiet, being silent. It took about 15 minutes to do this, and the headache almost disappeared. 3 or 4 weeks later, we received the comment that he was surprised that the headache hadn't returned. That is why this is a key example, a clear example of what can happen. At the same time, I try to be careful with this. I don't mean to say that every situation can be solved in the same way, right? There may be processes that are more complex, that take more time. So we're not speaking about healing fast. Every case should be taken separately. Hello. I am a student and I find your practices very useful. I was wondering whether within the therapy could we do something similar to what we do with students but with our clients. At the beginning of the therapy, there are some moments of connection prior to the patient or the client starting talking. Exercise, a small exercise, 5-minute exercise in order to reach a deeper connection. In principle, this sounds possible, and also I try to realize whether this is appropriate for that client at that time, because there are times in which to propose this to a client may be invasive, may be threatening, or weird even. So I think that at those moments then it wouldn't be appropriate, but then at other moments it might be timely, and we could say, okay, let's take a break, and can you focus on how are you feeling right now regarding everything we are discussing. Thank you, Salvador. It's Salvador and I go back a long way. Actually, I don't want to ask anything because my experience as someone that has felt and feels accompanied and accompanying others, my experience is congruent to what you are describing. My experience in terms of training people who want to learn these mysteries, I am not going to ask anything. I would just like to highlight that what you have just said, and you said it in a very warm and juicy Mexican style, and you say it so kindly, is not easy to achieve. It is not a new age recipe. You say, okay, this is the step 1, and that is the second, and then you do this, and then you do that. It could be a very tough experience, and a stepping stone, as you said, this inner silence. I am almost 70 years old now, and sometimes I find myself without any inner silence. So, it's hard to be in that state. It is not something that can be easily achieved. It implies a lot of work, a lifelong effort. So that is what I wanted to say. Thinking in terms of trainees, this shouldn't be taken lightly. However, it should be reminded that it is a hard piece of work for any human being. Thank you, Luis. Let me take advantage of this last question I'll make myself, as Charles did yesterday, and I'd like to briefly mention an aspect that we have introduced when we worked with activities. Sometimes we work in groups of 3, and one of these 3 people is the observer, and I introduced something that worked very well, and it's you're not an observer, because the observer usually observes from the outside. So we said you are an accompanying witness, and the invitation is that you let yourself feel what is going on there. And it has another implication. If our soul bodily presence generates interaction, then we are being affected. So what happens there will be different if the observer remains at a distance or if the observer becomes an accompanying witness, allowing himself or herself to feel what is happening at the interaction.
excelente presentación. Un placer. Muchas gracias. Excelente.